All right. Let me know if you guys can hear me. And we'll get started. So can everybody hear me? Everything's good to go, I'm assuming. I have green here, so I want to make sure. All right, well, I think you guys can hear me, so I'll just move on. Nobody's really talking. All right. So today it's all about CSS. Okay. So let's get started. For the slides here again. So let's go over. And again, we're just gonna look at the basics of CSS. Okay. I'm gonna show you some intermediate topics about CSS that I think it's almost like a requirement that you need to know given the state of modern website designs or just designs in general that need where your applications need to be responsive. They have to be able to work with various screen sizes as well as orientation changes, especially with mobile devices. You can have screen portrait and landscape modes, so your UI needs to adapt accordingly. Okay, so we're going to be going over that kind of stuff. So what is CSS? Okay, we've been talking a little bit about it here and there. I keep saying we're going to learn some CSS to make our, HTML look pretty, but, what is it really? So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, okay? It's used to style a web page, that's mainly what it's used for. Contains various utilities to help style based on various scenarios. We can use some max, min, and clap functions that we'll show. Pretty cool stuff. It's easy to learn, hard to master. Again, this entire MERN stack, if you haven't already guessed it, like a lot of the stuff is not too bad. It's very digestible, right? Like you could based off the stuff that you know now, you could probably build a very simple, primitive, website. Very primitive, very simple. Just with the stuff that you've been learning. If you've been practicing on your own time, and with the assignment, you should have something very 90s looking. With the CSS now, we'll be able to make those things look a lot, more modern. We can style them and stuff like that. Okay, but again, with all the stuff that you've been learning up to now, again, it's very easy in the beginning, but all this stuff is going to be just a long road, right, to mastery. Okay, that's a beautiful thing about this web stack that we're using. It's very beginner friendly. Okay, so it's easy to learn, but it's hard to master. There's just a lot of things you can do with it. So, and again, there's so many options to style. It's like, geez, your imagination is the only thing that's going to really, you know, limit you. So in CSS, we can, bring in some CSS to style our websites in a couple of different ways. So we can either write it in a separate file, which is the most ideal. You can write it in the style tag. And you can style every aspect of an HTML page, the font sizes, sizes of different elements, padding, margins, even animations. So CSS contains an animation layer. And then there's many frameworks for CSS. There's something called Bootstrap. Maybe a lot of you guys have probably heard of this. A lot of people talk about, oh, we just bootstrap it or whatever. That's what they're talking about. Sass, an object-oriented way of writing some CSS. That's pretty dope. And then Tailwind CSS, which is what we're going to be focusing on after I go through the CSS, just to show you some of the basics. We're going to then, take a little tour into the Tailwind world, and then basically throughout the course, while we build our social media application, we will be using Tailwind basically exclusively. So that's going to be our framework of choice. It's going to be Tailwind. But again, we're also going to have to understand CSS as well. So we'll be doing a lot of CSS on top of using a utility like Tailwind. Didn't everyone go crazy tricking out their MySpace pages? Oh boy, do I remember those days. Yeah, everybody had a weed background and stuff. That was everybody back then. Okay, so now we have a new tag under our belt here. In the head, we have this new tag that we can use, a style tag. Okay, and then here I even show you like how you can write a comment. So much like JavaScript, how you can have multi-line comments, it's the same way you would do it in CSS. So you don't really have single line comments, you just have multi-line comments like that in CSS, and that's about it. Okay. So this is where you would put all your styles in. Okay. And then here I just wrote some very basic HTML. I have a heading, the main heading for the entire article, the entire document here. And then have a section with a subheading and a little paragraph with some lorem ipsum. Okay, so super basic. All right, so this is the result. This is what we get off of that. Okay, it's super simple, super basic. Okay. So let's go into this style tag now. Okay, that we just saw. So with the style tag, we can target. That's what we call targeting. Okay, we can target things. So we can style things by targeting specific HTML elements. So for example, anything that's a tag, we can target with CSS. So HTML is a tag, body is a tag, section's a tag, H2 is a tag, P is a tag. All these things, okay, they're part of the document. They are targetable by CSS. So here we're targeting the body tag. That's this tag. We're gonna target it by doing it this way, okay? And then it almost looks like a JSON object, right? It's very similar, right? You have the curly braces there, and you have a key value pair. So the keys are going to be the things that you can actually style. So for example, color. There's also font. There's also margin, padding, etc. And in the values, remember, this is just like a tuple. The value is just whatever the value that that particular attribute can accept. In this case, there are certain keywords that are built into CSS like white, black, brown, magenta, purple, and some other stuff. Blue, for example, green, yellow. There are certain words that mean that are specific colors. They just represent RGB colors. So we can just say color blue, right? So in CSS there are some things like that. Obviously, this is not the best way, because if you need a very specific thing, you can also use hex codes. Okay. All right. So here, all I'm saying, hey, I want you to target the body tag. Okay. Target the body element. And then I want to write a rule. The rule is that the color must be blue. Okay. So the color attribute changes the color of the text. So this is the text. So any of the content. Okay. So remember, again, I'm targeting just the body, but let's see what effect that has on our page. And now you'll notice that everything is now blue. Okay, everything is now blue. Okay, so now let's think about this. Why is that? Well, all the elements within the tag specified is affected. Okay, so I say here that notice that the P tag is nested deeply, but is still affected. The style rule affects any tag. Okay, that's any of the children. Okay. So now the idea is, can we be more specific, right? Instead of just targeting, the body, can we be a little bit more specific? And I say spoiler, yes, we can. Okay. So now I have some new rules. So instead of targeting the body in a very general sense, I will now target the H1 because I have an H1 right here. There's an H2, a section, a P tag. So I say, okay, H1s, all H1s, I want you to be blue. Now I'm going to target the H2s, and I want their colors to be red. And I'm going to target all sections, and I want them to be brown. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. And there we go. So the H1 is blue, the H2 is red, and then anything inside of a section is now this brown color. Okay, so you can already see how we can start targeting specific elements of our page using simple rules. Now, how is this working? Well, that's the cascading. That's the C in CSS. Things cascade. So CSS is built on the idea of cascading. So things just, they kind of just trickle down. Remember I showed you the DOM tree? We built that tree. Well, it just finds the first tag that you are specifying with CSS, and it's going to apply to all of its children, to that entire branch, until you overwrite it. Okay? So CSS is built on the idea of cascading. Duplicate rules defined later will override previous rules. Okay, but does it though? So here we go. So I have an H1 here. I say color blue. I have an H2 and I say color red. And then I duplicate the rule. I have another H2 right underneath the previous H2. And I say color black. And then section color brown. Okay, so you'll notice that these two are duplicates. They happen twice. Okay, so let's see what happens here. So again, let's keep in mind the H2. So the H2 is this subheading. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, well, the subheading turned black. Okay, everything else is what the rule said, but here the subheading went from red to black, because the second H2 overrode it. Okay, but I said, but did it though? Okay, so now you might be asking, but why? Why does it do that? Because of cascading. Okay, the order in which you write things matters. Okay, so later defined styles overrule the specific properties, but not the entire rule. Okay, so the entire style sheets can overrule each other. So you need to be careful. So the order in which you bring in your CSS, especially from different files, is actually going to matter. Okay, so here's another example of an H2, two H2 rules right here. However, one is coloring the content red, and then here for H2, I'm changing the font style to italic. Okay, so which rule would win? This H2 or this other H2? They're defining different properties. So what happens here? Does one override the other one, or do they just fuse? So let's see what happens. And you can see that now we have a subheading that is both red and italic. Okay. So this means that if you define a rule later on, if you're targeting the same attributes, whichever rule came last wins. But if you're specifying a different attribute, it just combines those rules together. Okay, so this is actually a pretty powerful thing to understand about CSS. Once you understand that about CSS, that's what starts to unlock, the power of utility classes like Tailwind, which only target very specific attributes to do very specific jobs. But you can put them all together and they just compound on one another, and it just makes the CSS very straightforward to work with. All right, so again, like I said, we can have the CSS in a separate file, which is kind of what you want, most of the time. You want to have things, in separate files. So that's a good practice to offload the CSS into its own file. The advantages that you can take by doing this is something called cache, is obviously caching, but also cache busting. So this actually gives you faster load times, because the way it works is when the HTML gets loaded into the browser, the HTML comes first, not the CSS or the JavaScript. The head tags, any of those links will get evaluated later. So the HTML comes in, and then the HTML says, "Hey, I need to load up the CSS file." Okay. So the browser will do is it's going to look at the name of the CSS file, like the entire location, and if it already has it, if you already have used that CSS file before, instead of going out into the internet and grabbing it, it checks to see if it has a local version of it cached on disk. And if it does, it serves that. So it doesn't have to go out to the internet and grab it. So you save there. So you're decreasing the latency at the expense of, disk consumption. But then sometimes you make a change to the CSS file, the actual contents, but the name doesn't change. Well, if it's already on disk, the browser is not going to, do an HTTP request to grab the CSS file. It's just going to grab the one on disk. So if you did make a change, caching is actually working against you. So there's a concept called cache busting, which actually takes the hash of the content and appends that to the name of the CSS file. That way, if the contents change, so does the file name. It's not so complicated, but it's actually pretty cool. So this way, again, we take advantage of faster load times, but also any changes to the content will immediately get seen. Okay. All right. And then the other cool thing about having external style sheets is that you can have multiple developers working on the same page, but different aspects. So you can have one person working on the HTML specific things, another one working on the CSS or the styling, and somebody else working on the business logic, like JavaScript. Okay. All right. And the way we do this is using the link tag. Okay. So the link defines the relationship between the current document and the external source. Okay. So there's a relationship there. This is mostly used to link external style sheets. Does not support body only attributes, so you can't put CSS or HTML elements inside of a link. It's a self-closing tag, much like BR and input. Okay. So there's two attributes that you need to know for link, and that's href, which is again just a string. That's going to be the URL or URI location of the resource. And then we have the rel, which is stands for relationship. So it's a relationship between the resource and the document. So if you were using, let's say, I don't know, TensorFlow in your web application, TensorFlow has a requirement that you need to you have to include the license to your, the license of the software somewhere in your application. So if you were using something like TensorFlow Lite, which is something that you can use on the web, you need to have the license somehow in your document. The way you can do that is through the link tag. You can actually link the license for any open source software that you're using the link tag. It's usually customary that you have one file that has all of the licenses for all the software you're using in one file. That's usually what's actually done. That way, there's only one file to be served. All right. And then again, so if you have a license, that's how you would do that. And then if you have a style sheet, which is what we're talking about, that's where you would put that. Okay. And there's other things that you can obviously use rel for. Okay. So here's an example of I just created a file called styles.css. I put in some rules, and then here's my index.html. They're in the same directory. So here's my link to bring in the styles, the style sheet that's in a different file. I just say link rel. The relationship that this document has, the CSS file to my HTML file, is that this is a style sheet. Okay, so you just say relationship, it's a style sheet, and then where can we grab that? So if I just say styles.css, it's going to assume you mean /styles.css. If you were grabbing the styles from a completely different place, you would need to put the entire URL, which is http domain.com/whatever. Okay, and that's it. And now we don't have the styles in here. Now we're offloading it to a completely different file. So that's great. Now you're not polluting the HTML document. So that's really good. Cool. And again, we have no difference now. So the CSS is coming from a completely different file, but all the rules are still applying. So that's great. All right, so now let's look at the cascading order of CSS. How does this work? Who wins? Who wins the race? Okay, because there's three different ways of adding CSS to your HTML documents. So the first one is inline. That's one thing you can do. That is, you just say style, equals whatever. So you have that. So that's the highest one. So when you have a style that's inline like this, so you use your HTML element and you use the style attribute, this one wins all the time. This one wins first. Then you have the inside of the HTML document, you have a style tag that goes second. That goes second. And then you have an external one, which comes from like outside. So that'll go last. Okay. So depending on where you put your styles, based off this order, depends who's going to win in the case that two different rules are targeting the same attribute. So if they were all changing the color of the text, the one that would ultimately win would be inline, then internal, which is like using the style tags in your HTML head, and then finally any external CSS files. Okay, so that's the precedence. Okay, so before we go through that, let's try some stuff here. Okay, so I'm gonna stop that. There we go. Yes, I trust the authors. Okay. All right, so let's try some stuff here. So I will just delete all of this. Start again. So some CSS. Okay. So let's try some stuff here. So let's have a H1, and we'll call this H1 heading, whatever. And then we'll have a section here. The section will have an H2. Call this H2 heading. Okay, then here we'll have a P tag. So here we'll do I think it's you just do lorem. There we go. Now we have some random text there. If I right click here and I say open with live server, let's start this up. Here we go. H1 heading, H2 heading, and then we have our lorem ipsum. Okay, cool. All right. So let's try a different. Let's try a few things here. So let's go to the head, okay, and then do a style tag here, and let's target H1. Okay, so there we go. We're targeting H1. That's nice. Now let's put a style in there. So let's say the color. I want to change the color. Okay, and again, you have all these pre-built colors that are already in here. Okay, but then like, what if you're looking for a very specific color? So you can go to like a color tool or something. Not color. Well, yeah, okay, this works. All right, so okay, actually, you know what? Let me show you a really good place to get colors, and that's material.io. Okay, remember when you're doing designs for your website, you need to have, I mean, if you want to be a good designer, that is, you need to have a guide. Okay, you need to have a set of design rules that you abide by when you're designing your whatever, if it's an app or if it's a website or a desktop application, it doesn't matter. You need to have some type of guide. Okay, if you have none because you're a beginner, so you literally have nothing, that's fine. You pick a design guide and you stick with that so you can learn. And then as you learn, maybe you come up with your own opinions of things. That's fine. That's part of like you growing as a designer. Okay, that's totally fine. And then as you see other designers, you can like start like, Frankensteining and learning some stuff, and then you come up with your own design principles. Okay? I would suggest that if you're gonna, start with designing and stuff, you start off with material design. Just start there. Now, the reason why I say this is because this is not backed up by opinions. Okay? Yes, there might be some opinions here and there, but this is actually backed by extensive studies that the Google team has done. So they're not here trying to tell you, oh, we think this, we think that. No, they're saying, yo, we made like a bunch of different designs. We tested it on people using psychology, and then this happened to be the results. They weren't trying to like push a very specific design narrative. They just tested it out with like a bunch of people, and then this was the results they came up with. So the following designs that you're going to see here in material website is based off research. Okay, so if you don't like it, that's totally fine. But there's a reason why these designs exist, is because it's how humans like to look at things. Okay, and if you want your application, whatever it is, a website, app, even a video game, you're going to live and die by your user interface and the user experience. If your application is functional, but it's really hard to use and navigate, you're not going to be able to retain your user base. That's just how it is. People don't want to have to do research on how to use your application. Okay? So I would say if you're going into design, or if this interests you, please, please, please read this. There's a blog there. There's a bunch of resources and stuff like that. Just go through this. Again, yes, it's opinionated in a way, but it's backed up by research. Okay, so that's all I'll say about this. All right. So under the resources, we click on resources. They have a bunch of really cool things, and here we have a color palette creator. Okay. So the way what material kind of believes is like, you shouldn't have infinite colors. You need to pick a palette and you need to kind of stick with it, right? That creates consistency. And if you're going to have branding, that's another thing you have to put on top of this, okay? So here, in the material design guide here, how they use colors, there are like real real research here that you can go in and start reading about all this stuff, like hierarchy. So like how scales work, even how you're using colors, legibility, you need high contrast, expressive, like certain actionable items need to have like a certain meaning. So like if something is a button and it's bright blue and it's on your screen, people's eyes are going to gravitate. So there needs to be meaning behind these things. So you can use color as one way, as a way to drive some of these things. So whatever that may be for your application. Okay. So where's the color picker? So it went to design and go to resources, and then right here, color interface tool. So that was the wrong one. So this basically is going to teach you how you should design and mock the colors, but this is actually going to help you to actually pick the colors. So we go here, color interface tool. Here we go. And then here there's a bunch of colors, right? These are pre-picked colors that Google has. You can also use your custom color. So you can just pick a color, whatever you want. And you can see on the left, here are some like even look at the color, how it's changing. It'll go from like a black to like a white, depending on, contrast and stuff. If it's really, really dark on the edges here, they'll turn white, just for legibility's sake, So if you have a favorite color you want to use, like whatever it may be, you have a color there, and it tells you what the primary color should be, light, dark, and over here it tells you the text. What color should the text be when it's on the primary color? So you have stuff like that. Okay. Or you can just pick one of these colors, and then it'll pick a lot of things for you. You can see what it's going to look like throughout your application, right? At least how they would recommend it to look. And then you have accessibility, which actually Corbin has agreed to actually do an accessibility talk where he talks about stuff like this. So how the colors that you pick for your application is going to affect the way it's actually going to be ranked a certain number, right? Based off that ranking says whether your application is accessible or not. So color is just one of the many factors. Okay. All right. Anyways, I went on that entire rant. So if you want to pick a color, you should pick a color that that makes sense and it fits with the theme of your application and yada yada yada. But you can also pick the hex color here, so we can actually copy that. So that's cool. Got a color there, and then you can paste it right there. That's it. Hit save, and you can even see the color. And in VS Code, when you use a hex color, it actually can recognize it. And so when you hover over this color, you can actually change the color if you want to something else, whatever. All right, we hit save. We're going over here. You can see my heading is now this interesting gold color. Right? Go over here, we can change it, whatever. Let's go with like, okay, that's pretty nice. Save, go back, there's the heading. It's a nice color, but the back, you can see why you can't just pick any old color. You have to be careful where this content, where it lives on, what is its surface. The background is too bright. You can barely tell that that thing exists. So just by the color, and I'm going off on a little tangent here, but just on the color, when you look at this entire document, what pops to your head? Like right now, where does your eyes kind of, gravitate to naturally? As soon as you look at this, where are your eyes going? Anybody want to look at this and tell me where their eyes are going when they look at the document? Where does your eye kind of focus on? Is it heading 1, or is it heading 2, or is it the little text? Yours is going to, yeah, so the top left, but where are you like where is your eyes kind of like targeting? Is it this, or is it this? So Victoria and Emmanuel both saying that even if I tell you look at the H1 tag, even if I tell you, hey, I want you to look at the H1 heading, your eyes are kind of getting forced to go to the H2. But why is that? Like I'm trying to look at H1, but like I can see my peripheral vision keeps focusing on H2. And exactly right, it's too light. So again, so with that little experiment, you're going to see why, why this entire tool that I'm showing you here, not just that, but this entire website that Google has put together is effective. So when you go into color palette creator, whatever, any of these things, you can read here. These are also some other design resources, but I would go here and basically just read, right? I don't know why it keeps going over there. You guys should read this entire thing on how you can use color. So you can use color for hierarchy. I use color, even though this is bigger than this, I used color to change the hierarchy of how you're actually looking at this. So even though this came first and is bigger, by me changing the color to be lighter and less noticeable, it now has less emphasis. And because this is the next one that has the most contrast, your eyes gravitate to it. It's pretty crazy how the mind works like that. It's very interesting. So I would advise you to go in here and just read and like just digest all this information. They even have like some little videos here. They're like GIFs. Shows you some whatever, how to distinguish different elements. It's very beautiful. Okay, so there's a real science behind this. This is a lot of research that Google has done. There's a reason why their apps are very nice to use. And it's very, very, very simple. And anybody can use Google Apps. They're very, very simple to use, but also very welcoming. Okay, so it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise. Okay, so that's a very cool exercise that we were able to do there. Okay, so keep that in mind. That little experiment that we just did, you should keep that in mind for later on. Okay. All right. So there's my H1. I change the color. I can go here to my H2. And I can, maybe change the background. So I say background color. So let's say I change this one to beige. Why not? Hit save. And look at that. The background of the H2 tag expands all the way out. It's not just the text, up to the text, it's the entire thing. Because H1s, H2, they all display as a block. Okay, they're all block display. So block display means that it wants to take up the width of its parent. Okay, the entire width of its parent. What is the parent of H2? What's the parent of H2? Anybody? What's the parent of H2? Can anybody hear me? Hello, hello, hello. Nobody wants to participate? All right. Well, the parent of the H2 is the section, right? The parent of the H2 is in fact the section. Okay. So the body relative to the H2, that's the grandparent. So this is the parent, section is the parent, and then body is like the grandparent. Okay, so section is the parent of H2. Okay, what is a section? Well, a section is also a display block type. So the section also wants to expand the entire width of its parent. Okay, so what's the parent? What's this? What's the parent of section? Well, now that's the body, and the body wants, and so the body also is expanding the entire viewport, right? So, and I can prove this because I can say section. I can change its background color to, let's say, I don't know, is there a gold color? Yeah, gold. Okay. So now the background of section is now this gold color, and you can see it right there. Okay. You can see that. Okay. Now, the section also includes the H2. Now, the reason why like they're not blending is because the top one is not transparent. There's no alpha on it. Okay. So, if I were to add some transparency to the background color of this H2 tag, you will actually see the gold. So if I just remove this right here, I just comment that out for H2, you'll notice that H2 is part of section. It takes up the entire thing, and the section goes the entire width. Right? Interesting. Okay. So what is the width of the body then? Because if I don't know if you can see, but if you'll notice, the section doesn't go all the way to the end. It kind of stops, almost like there's some kind of spacing rule there. Okay, so let's see. Let's change the body. Oh, the body, we're going to change the background color to, let's say blue-violet. Why not? Okay, here we go. Oh, there you go. Interesting. This kind of looks like the Lakers colors, right? The purple and gold. All right. So let's check it out. There seems to be some spacing here, so the section doesn't go all the way. What's going on? Well, the thing is that the body tag has some default CSS rules already attached to it. It has some default stuff. One of those things is that it has some padding. So padding, okay, not to be confused with margin, padding basically says how much spacing we're going to push the children in. Okay, remember, section is a child of the body. So we're just going to push, as you can see here, we're going to push the contents some amount of pixels over. So I think this is like, I don't know, 2 pixels or something like that. So we can actually prevent this by just saying padding 0. Let me go back. 0 pixels. Oh, so it's not doing that. So it's got to be the margins then. Margin 0. Oh, wait, hold on. This one's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because some of these actually have margins associated with them. So if you didn't want to have any of these paddings and margins, the thing you can do to stop that from happening is to actually quote unquote reset the margins and paddings to every element. And the easiest way to do that, which actually is a nice way so you guys can learn this, is using the wildcard. So the wildcard is a star. So star means anything. Okay, so in this context, we do it like that. We're saying any element. Doesn't matter which one. We can say padding to be 0. And the other one you want to reset is the margins. We want to be in control of the padding and the margins. Okay, now that we do that, you'll notice that we no longer have any padding there. It's all gone. Okay, it's all gone. But now you'll notice that there's some things that have collapsed. The headings collapsed because they had some default paddings. Okay. Of course, we can go here now. We can add our own padding. So we can say padding to the top. We can add, I don't know, for the H1, we'll say 4 pixels to the top. So now you'll notice that there's more spacing here than there is here, but we can increase that spacing. We can say padding bottom, say 4 pixels. Okay, you see that there's now more. So let me push this to the side here like that, and I bring this up like that. So H2, it's very tight right there, right? So I can say padding top. Let's do 4 pixels. Save. And you'll see that you see how it came down a little bit. And then we'll say padding bottom. Do some 4 pixels as well. So we want to be in charge of this spacing. We want to handle it. Nobody else. Let us do it. Okay. So you can see this is looking a little better, right? We have some nice spacing there. And if these two things are too close to each other, right? There's a couple ways you can do this. One, you can do a margin, which is pushing things away. So we say margin top. We can say, let's say 4 pixels. You can see I'm pushing it away. I'm pushing the H2 down. So to exaggerate it, I'm pushing it 10. So you can see we're being very, very pushy here. We're just pushing things 15 pixels, pushing it more down. Let's do something like 50 pixels to make it even more abundant and clear. You can see how we're pushing things down with a margin. So margins is basically forcing spacing between elements. Okay, so margins create spacing between elements. Okay, so I can prove this to you by using our little tool here. This one. Once you open up the inspector, you have your developer tools. If you click on this, now every time we highlight an element, we get some information. So if we hover over the H2, you'll notice that there is that pink border that happens. You'll see that pink border. That's the margin. That's the margin. So what margins do is it creates spacing between elements. Okay? Versus padding, you'll see the padding is it's hard to tell. Let me change some of these colors. Let's remove this. Okay, maybe that'll help it better. Okay. When I hover over the H1 tag, do you see the green? The green that's on top and the bottom of this H1 tag? Do you guys see that? That's called padding. That's the padding that we see there. Okay. So the difference here, when you hover over H2, the H2 has this right here, which is the padding. That's the padding. But then you'll notice that we also have this like other color there. Okay, that's the margin. Well, it's not necessarily the green. It's just like, usually it's blue. Blue highlights the entire width. And then you have like this other color. In this case, it's green over here. It's like, because the color's kind of transparent, it blends in with the background color. So it's like this really weird color. I don't know what color that is. I'm not an art major, so I don't know what the color is. It's just, you have to pay attention. But there you can see the padding. So if I were to like increase the padding of H2 to something ridiculous, like let's say 40 and 40. Okay, now when I hover over H2, you'll notice that the H2 it's only covering this text, and now you have this big old space right there. So margin is distance between tags, and padding is distance inside the tag. Exactly. So Jim Bob has it exactly. So if we were to use like the best editing software on the planet, which is MS Paint, let's draw something real quick so we can really bring this home. Okay, so let's say you're designing a website, and you had these two cards. Okay, so this is going to be like an image here, We'll use like a default image like that. This is supposed to represent some kind of image, right? Who cares what it is? Maybe a person posted this. Okay, there's a triangle. That's not a triangle. Let me do better than that. That's not a triangle. Here we go. That's triangle. All right, whatever. All right, so that's supposed to be an image, and then here you have some text. Like let's say you have a H1 text here. Okay, and we'll just draw a little border right here. Okay, all right. The spacing that we have here, this spacing, this gap, is called a margin. The margin works for both. In this case, this margin is like, it's more of a margin, a spacing between elements that is like horizontal. Okay, so in CSS, we can target the spacing between elements in a couple different ways. So you have to be specific. If you wanted this spacing between these two items, then you have to think about the following. It's like, okay, do I want this element to push things away from it from the right? If that's true, you would do a margin. Oops, let's spell that correctly. You would do a margin right. Okay? You would do a margin right. Okay, if you wanted spacing to go from here out. Okay? Relative to this one. Okay, so you would use margin right. Or the other way to solve this problem is you add spacing to the left of the element relative to this guy. So this is card 1, this is card 2. So this problem can be solved in two ways. You add margin to card 1 to the right, so it pushes things to the right, or use a margin left, margin underscore left. I think it's hyphen left. So margin left, and then you push things relative to card 2 to the left by whatever pixels, X amount of pixels, whatever it may be. That's not an X. My brain's all over the place. So by X pixels. Okay, pick a number, 5 pixels, 10 pixels, whatever. So there's two ways to solve this problem. Right? So at this point, it just depends, you know, how these rules, how you want to set up the rules. Okay? Now, what's padding then? So padding, just like Jim said, is just the distance, is basically the spacing, but within the body. Okay? So let's say this entire card is my constraint. Okay? So let's say I gave this card a very specific height. So it has a very specific H and a very specific width. Okay? So we have a height and we have a width. If I wanted things to, like, I say, oh, you know what, this H1 is the text. Here, let me actually do this better. Let me scribble this. Okay, let's say your text was like over here. So here's your H1 on the first card. And again, you're probably going to duplicate the same rules. So it's going to affect H2 as this one over here. Card 2 is H1. You're like, man, this text is too tight, right? So how could you push it over? Would you use margins? Well, I mean, you probably could, but that's not a good idea. That's not a good use of margins. So what you want to do is you want to add some padding. So if this piece right here was a different tag, like another div, so you have a nested div, this way you can separate your elements, then you could add padding to this thing. So one thing you could do is you could say padding left and right, or just left in this case, and you can actually push it over. So the distance from this edge to here, to this content here, relative to this container, okay, this is called padding. I'm running out of room here, so that's padding. Specifically, relative to this container, this very thick container that I'm highlighting here, this would be called padding to the left. We're adding padding to the left side. Then you can also add padding to the left, to the right. You can add padding to the bottom, and then padding from the top. You guys see that? The difference? So padding is how you're squishing things closer. You're squishing things closer. And then margins, you're pushing elements away from each other. Does that make sense? The difference between these two things? Like when I was first learning CSS, I was so confused between padding and margins. I was so lost. I didn't know what the difference was. And then finally, I just drew a picture and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So hopefully this helps. So padding inward, margin is outward. Yeah, you could say that, yeah. Yeah. Padding equals adding, subtracting pillows to your body. Yeah, exactly. And then margin is basically, your social distancing, right? Why would you use one over the other? So that's a good question. Why would you use one over the other? So is there an easy way to do this? Uh, yes, okay. Actually, maybe I can just show you real quick. Why would you use one over the other? That's a really good question. And I can probably show you. Okay. Okay, let's see. Actually, let me bring back the paint. All right, so the question is, why would you use one over the other? All right. So let's say we had a container, okay, and there was two items that were next to each other like this. Okay. And then these two containers, these two things, were inside of something else. Okay. Now let's say you wrote your rules such that this container, we'll call this C1, and this container, we'll call this C2, will scale based off the width of its parent container. So we'll call this the parent. Call that P1. Okay. Now let's say your boss says, yo, these things are too crammed. Let's add some spacing. So Victoria is saying, when would you pick one over the other? Okay. Let's start with padding. So if I were to do padding, the way the width of these two containers is going to be calculated, again, I'm not going to specify a width. I'm just going to let the widths of these two containers scale based off the width of its parent. Okay, that's the default way that block displays work. They always try to consume the same width as the parent if possible. Okay. Okay. So if I do a padding, imagine this. Imagine container 1 wants to take 50%, container 2 wants to take 50%. It's even. Okay. If I add padding, what's actually going to end up happening is that I'm going to end up squeezing these containers on this side and this side. So effectively, what happens if I were to use padding is I would actually make these actually smaller, and they're not actually getting any further apart. Okay, this is what padding would do. If I were to add some serious padding, this is what padding would do. Okay, that's what padding would do. So immediately, this is the opposite of what your boss wanted, right? Your boss wanted you to put some spacing between here. It's like, okay. So your next concern would probably be like, okay, well, what if, like, let's say let's bring some text here. So there's some text, there's some text, there's some text, there's some text. Okay. The text is too close. So your next thing would be like, okay, let me take C1 and let me add some padding. So effectively, I'm going to squeeze the content here and here. And I'm also going to squeeze the content there and there. So let's see what padding ends up doing. So what padding will end up doing is it's going to end up pushing the content closer. Now, this content is pretty long, this text. So what's going to end up happening probably is you're going to have wrapping. So some of the text may wrap. Okay. Okay. Now, I drew this border, but what if your containers did not have a border around it? So let's say that the background color of containers 1 and 2 was the same background color as your parent 1. So if like the background was blue, then this would be blue as well. So you actually would not have any distinction. There'd be no borders, right? Let's say there was no borders. Then honestly, this probably worked, right? By adding some padding to the container, you kind of push the content inward. That effectively did what? What did that effectively do? That pushed, that effectively pushed the content away from each other by adding the padding. So did that solve your problem? Well, maybe, but it's possible that it introduces other problems. So what if we use margins? Okay, so let's see what happens if we were to use margins. So if we were to use margins, the content could still stay the same. Okay, the content could still stay the same. Okay. But because we have margins, we're going to now create a spacing. So what's going to actually end up happening is you're going to have this. So let's say I put a spacing here of like, whatever, 4 pixels or something like that. Okay. Like that, like that, like that. So I'm going to add some spacing. So now we have this. Okay. So the widths of C1 and C2 stayed the same. We pushed them away from each other, and P1's width grew. Okay. So whatever this change in M was, change in margin, P1's width is now, let's say W prime is now the old W plus the change in however much margin you added. So P1 grew. If it's the case that P1's width is auto scaling. If that's the case, then the margin effectively made P1 bigger. See, before we didn't make P1 bigger. It stayed the same width. But if we use a margin inside to push the containers to the side, it's going to it's going to make P1 bigger. But what if P1 had a fixed width? What if W was actually fixed? Meaning we say, oh, all P1s, we said all P1s must be 240 pixels in width. And we added a margin. What the heck happens? Okay, well, if that's the case, then something dangerous happens. Which is why you have to be careful. So, if we were to do that, add the spacing, but P1 was fixed, so let's say that the width had to be 240 pixels, then this is what would have actually occurred. We still would have gotten the spacing between the containers. Okay, we still would have gotten the spacing. However, okay, so let me exaggerate this a little bit. So let's say the containers were this big. Okay. Then what actually ends up happening is, yes, we space them out, but now they're bleeding. They're bleeding outside of the parent. Okay. So they're no longer contained within the boundaries of the parent. They're now bleeding over. So if you had multiple of these things right next to each other, right? Like if you let's say this was a scrollable field. So you had like a scroll bar, so you can scroll left and you can scroll right, and you had a bunch of these next to each other, it's possible they would overlap and they would Z fight each other. Right? So this content here would bleed over to another card that was right next to it or something. They'd probably like bleed over and touch like this. You still have your spacing there, but they'd bleed over like that, right? And this is right here, that's P2. Okay. Do you see that what would happen if you were to do a margin like that when the parent container had a fixed width? This is what could occur. So you have to be careful. So yeah, you can use margins. Yeah, you can use padding. Sometimes you have to use a mix of the both in order to achieve your in order to fix your or achieve the solution to your problem. So the answer is it depends, and it's kind of a little, you have to understand what the constraints are to the parent before you start just using margins everywhere. Um, uh, because it's possible that you might push elements outside and they might start bleeding. That's a possibility. That's a possibility. So we have to be careful about that. Okay. So I know it's not a direct answer when you should use one over the other, but I'm showing you some edge cases and things that you need to look out for, and using a mix of both of them could help. So in this case, honestly, if you need to add more spacing, the answer would be yes, add margin, but also you're going to need to increase the size of P1. You would need to increase the size of P1, or the containers that hold these other containers. So you would have to do a mix of both. Add margin plus increase the width of the parent. Else you risk having the contents bleed out if you put too much spacing in the middle. So you have to be mindful of your situation to choose which one to use. Yes, because you could cause it to bleed. Now, if the containers could still fit, right? Maybe you add some margin and then you decrease the width of the containers or something like that. Then yeah, that could work. But this assumes a couple of things. This assumes P1's width is fixed, C1 and C2's widths are fixed in this situation. If they're dynamic, you will squeeze them. It's almost like you would squeeze them so the widths would become smaller, but you're okay. But if C1 and C2 are fixed in widths, then you're kind of screwed. Okay. So that's why using fixed widths for things is kind of dangerous. So if you have containers, like parent containers, yes, these should be fixed width. Everything inside of it should be some percentage. You should not use pixels, because if you want your content to be dynamic in nature, you risk bleeding your content out. So you need to find like a good strategy of like, okay, should I have scrolling ability in my containers? That might be one way you can solve this problem. But Google says that, for example, if you have items, whoops, not that. If you have items like this, Google says this is terrible design. If you have horizontal scrolling, so horizontal scrolling like that, then the content, this is your items, these are items. Your items should not be allowed to have vertical scrolling. Vert scrolling should not be possible. We should not have vertical scrolling in items that are already horizontally scrolling. That's very hard to use. So you need to avoid it. Which again that's what I'm saying. Like if you use margins, if the widths are like, if the content doesn't fit or something, you have to make some changes. Scrolling may not solve those problems because it depends on, are you already scrolling horizontally? Your content should not vertically scroll. If your content is vertically scrolling, you should probably not be horizontally scrolling at the same time for those particular items. Now, Netflix, you might say, well, Netflix does it. Well, no, they don't. Their items, you have basically two things. With Netflix's UI, it goes like this, and it works. You have items that are laid out right here. Okay. Obviously, you have a bunch of items, right? So you have vertical scrolling. But then you have items that are like this, and those have horizontal scrolling. This is fine. This is fine because the individual items are not scrollable. If Netflix had something where it had the item like this, and then on the item you could also scroll, that'd be terrible design. There's a reason why a lot of these UIs almost look identical to each other. Like when you look at like Disney Plus, or if you look at Netflix, something like that, or even like Amazon Prime, you'll notice that's like, wow, everybody has the same interface. It's just like horizontal scrolls, and then like the items is just a picture with a title of the movie. No, it's not because they're copying off each other. It's because that's the best design. There is no other way of doing it. Like that is literally the best design because of the fact that you have too many items, and then like it's a bad idea to have each item be able to be scrollable. That's terrible, especially if it's already scrolling and on the opposite axis. It's too hard. But this solves it, right? You have your categories here. Like here it could be like action movies, action. You have drama, drama for your mama, as they say. You have some comedies right here, comedies. So these are categories, and then these scroll horizontally, and then like you have more categories down here, so then you can scroll vertically. That's okay, because the individual items aren't scrollable. So you can mix and match them, but it depends. As long as the items themselves are not scrollable, you're okay. Again, today's supposed to be about CSS, but CSS and design are like very linked together. So you have to start thinking about like, okay, when I'm using my CSS, how should I do this? What's the best way? Again, that's why I said you should look at something like material, go to the components, and you say, ask yourself, okay, how do I want to do a card? You go here, and then you look at in a demo of like how you should design a card. Is your card going to have images? That's how it should look like. Is it going to have supporting text? That's how it should look like. Should my card have a button? That's how it should look like. Okay, and you can even click here and check. And there's two different ways. You have elevated, which adds this shadow, makes it look like it's popping off the screen. And then you have outline, which is just an outline around the border. See, this is just an outline, a soft outline. And this one uses shadow, called elevated. You can even see it pop as I'm going back and forth. You can see it pop. See, that's the beautiful thing about material design, is that they kind of thought about all these things for you. How should checkboxes look? Well, that's how they should look. Okay, buttons. How should buttons look? These are buttons. You can have a leading icon. You have outlined version. You have text, just text. There's an outline, contained. This one has a shadow. These ones just have a border. Okay, these are already being thought out, so you don't have to really think about it, because you're going to follow a styling guide, like material, for example. Just follow this, and your designs will always look amazing. So on my website, I kind of followed the material style. So if you go to my website, you can see I use the same style. Like I have a solid button, but I also have an outline button. So when you look at this, for example, when you look at this, this is called a hero, right? You have the very first part of your website, this, you know, in this case, of this design, this is called a hero, which kind of brings attention to this page. If I ask you, hey, where are your eyes being drawn when you look at this section? Right? Where are your eyes being drawn to? Can anybody answer this question? Let's do another experiment. Where are your eyes being drawn to? Hello world. Okay, cool. So hierarchy, right? So textual hierarchy, hello world. So then after that, where does your eye then go to? The photo? Your eye goes to the photo. Okay. All right. That's fine. That's actually good, because I'm kind of making you like look at the content. I'm kind of using the content here to force you to scroll through my website. That's good. Okay. Now between these two buttons right here, learn more in Discord, where does your eye go to? The learn more or the Discord? What do you feel is more emphasized? Learn more. You can see you guys aren't even like, I don't think you guys are in the same room, but like look how all of you guys have said the exact same thing. So hello world, that's the first thing you see. It's like, okay. Then you're kind of drawn to the content, like the image. It's like boom, it's like right there. But then like let's say you were like reading, okay. Your eyes then kind of get drawn to like you might read this, but then between these two buttons, you feel more like clicking this one than you do this one. You feel like this one's emphasized more than this, right? So then you would want to click here. You see how I'm kind of how I'm trying to get you to navigate my website without really telling you? Because I'm using color, I'm using like font size, all these things. I'm using it to draw you into my website. I'm using your brain. I'm fooling your brain into like telling it how to navigate my website. And that's the same thing about all websites do this, right? You see that a lot with login with it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay. It's a beautiful thing, all this stuff, right? It's very cool how you can use that kind of stuff to do stuff. Anyways, yeah. So, um, okay. So there's the margins and the padding stuff. Okay, cool. All right. So hopefully that makes a little sense there. And again, you can do all kinds of, you can do like font style. We can do italic, bold, stuff like that. Change the weight of something. The font weight is how thick the strokes are. So if I wanted to emphasize, H1 a little bit more, number one, I need to get rid of this color, right? Okay, so there we go. Let me get rid of all these colors. It's hurting my eyes. So there's H1, H2. Now spacing, there is a big problem. So let's remove some of the stuff. Let's say 4 pixels. 4 pixels. Okay, and margin top is too much. Okay, there we go. Now they're pretty. Now, let's say I did something like this. Let's say, let's put this all in the same level. Okay. Now, your eyes, you guys all agreed that H1, your eyes go to H1. Okay. Your eyes go to H1. Now, what happens if I were to flip this? So I have H2, then I have H1. How do you guys feel about that? Where does your eyes get drawn? Does it still get drawn to H1? Or is your brain kind of confused because you're bouncing between H1 and H2 because of the way I kind of like set that up? Because I also want you to read this text, but according to how I've changed the hierarchy, I kind of flipped it around, right? Usually hierarchy of scale is the things you want most emphasized are bigger and go to the top, and then you kind of funnel it down. So you think about hierarchy for scale, for font scale, you usually have the bigger H1s here, and then you kind of scale the hierarchy down. This is how you can use somebody's brain against them in order to like look at your contents. You start the H1, and then you have like a subheading here, and then you maybe can have like some subtext here, and then you have like your buttons, and then your buttons have its own hierarchy. So these buttons can have its own hierarchy of emphasis. You can have like a solid button have higher emphasis than, let's say, an outline, and then let's say a button that's just text. So a text button. You can change the order of this depending on the colors you use. See, there's a lot of There's a lot of variation. So Emmanuel says that my eyes go back and forth. So he when you look at this, you see H1, but then you see the H2, but then you go back to the H1. You have your eyes are going back and forth. So this is pretty trippy, right? How your eyes are just bouncing back and forth. But you can actually change that by just changing the color. So if I change the background, not the color, let's change the color to de-emphasize it. Let's go with like a gray color. Now what happens? What happens with your eyes now? Are you still bouncing back and forth? Or is it a little better? Like, you tell me. What do you feel when you see that? Like, is it on the right track to stop your eyes from bouncing, or is your eyes still going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? Or is it better? Now Emmanuel's saying that now his eyes are fixed on H1. Bit nicer because you stay on H1. Yeah, H2 is there and it's nice, but you can now bounce. Now you're like focused on H1. Even though I added extra content on the top, okay, I kind of flipped this thing on its head. I'm kind of going against this. I kind of like, I put my I put my H2 above my H1, but then it caused this back and forth, back and forth. But then what I then did was I de-emphasized this by just changing the color. So basically what I did was I changed its position in the hierarchy to actually something drastically lower by actually just changing the color. It's very weird, right? So you can actually do stuff like this. So it's all about how you use color, how you use sizes. Okay. I want to show you how you can do stuff like this, but also like I'm trying to show you the CSS, but I'm also trying to show you some logic. Like, what are some minor things that you can do in order to like make things look presentable, but also when you're looking at designs, how can you make someone's eye move across your content, right? So throughout the course, as we're doing the CSS stuff, I'm going to be bringing a lot of these concepts to you, like white spacing. Like, I think the spacing between H1 and this text is too, there's not enough spacing. So we'll fix that, right? Now let me zoom in here so we can kind of see it. Okay. Now, the problem here is that this dark color for this text is too dark. You should never use like completely black for text. You should use something that's relatively close, but not that much. In fact, all your text that you have in your document should not be pure black as far as the text is concerned. It's just too much. So what you should do is you just say for the entire body, everything's going to be inside the body. You should change the default color to something. So let's go with black real quick. Or yeah. Let's go with black real quick. And then I want to pull up the color wheel. And then here, we're going to de-emphasize a little bit. So instead of, we're going to do like an almost black. So 32, 32, 32 is a really nice one. Now, it's hard to tell, but like this is no longer pure black. It's an almost black. If anything, we could even de-emphasize it a little bit more. I like using C4. I think that's the one I like using. Like somewhere. Oh, this is RGB color, so I'm not gonna get the exact thing. So like C4. Oh no, this is for the other one. Is it C9? C9. There's a. I need to memorize my colors. There's a color that's pretty close to this. It's like right over here. There it is. I think that's what it is. Is it 2B? There's a really nice color that had a C in it. Let's go with this. Let's go with this one, 2021. There you go. It's incredibly subtle. Okay, it's incredibly subtle. Okay, but now this text is not like excruciating, like the contrast is not so deep, and the heading is like a little bit nicer to look at. Again, we could always change that by saying, you know, color black. And then you can see the difference here between this and this, right? I don't know if you guys can tell. Let me see if I can zoom in. Yeah, there we go. Look at the difference in the colors of this text. This is like that off black, and this is pure black, right? It's a little different, but we can actually use this to style our text to make sure it's not like so rudely high contrast. You won't do that too much either. So, and then the white, the background in white is too white. So you say background color. Let's start off with this white color. Then we go here and we do an off-white. So the background should never be completely white. Your text should never be completely black. Should always be like, oh, dang it, come on. There we go. Should always be off a little bit. So maybe something like that, E2, E2, E2. See? The background is no longer this blinding white color. It's no longer blinding white. And my text is no longer too dark. It's, you know, you could even go, maybe the white's probably a bit too off-white. So let's go just a slightly little brighter. Okay, there, that's better. Okay, okay. And so I've only ever so slightly changed the colors, but immediately this is starting to look a little different. This is immediately looking a little different to me. At least my eyes. You might not be able to see it in the stream, but as I'm looking at this, it looks different. It actually looks a little softer, and it's softer on my eyes. That's how I feel about it. And I think a majority of people actually feel that way too. You might not be able to see it on the stream, but if you were to write the same code that I wrote on your side and then look at it, you'll notice a difference. It's actually pretty interesting how this works with the eyes. Okay, so, all right. So we're running out of time here. Tomorrow, or Wednesday, the next time we meet, Wednesday, I'm going to go over the media tag. So this media tag is going to allow us to do some pretty cool stuff based off screen sizes. Okay, because again, let's look at this. We need to have our website or our application be able to change based off screen sizes, right? And also if they're landscape or portrait. We need to have these dynamics. So you don't want to have your article look like that. You need to be dynamic, okay? So we're going to work on that on Wednesday. So it should be very interesting, okay? All right, so if anybody has any questions about any of this CSS stuff, let me know. And if not, then I'll end it here. And we'll talk more on this stuff on Wednesday. So let me know if you have any questions. If not, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. All right, everybody's good? All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.